Mark Thompson had always been a man of big dreams but little patience. Growing up in a sleepy town in America, he spent most of his life daydreaming about faraway places, imagining himself standing in front of famous landmarks and soaking in the grandeur of history. For years, he saved every penny from his modest job at a local warehouse, determined to make his dream of traveling abroad come true. And finally, the day arrived. He was going to London, the city of kings, queens, and centuries-old traditions. The flight to London was long, cramped, and exhausting, but Mark didn't care. He stepped off the plane with wide eyes, clutching his backpack like it held all the treasures of the world. His itinerary was packed with iconic spots: Big Ben, the Tower of London, and, of course, Buckingham Palace. That last one excited him the most. He'd seen pictures of the changing of the guard ceremony online. It looked so formal, so rigid, almost robotic. Mark thought it would be funny to see those guards up close, standing still as statues while crowds gawked at them. But there was something else brewing beneath Mark's excitement, something darker. Back home, Mark wasn't exactly known for being easygoing. He often joked around to mask his insecurities, cracking sarcastic comments or making snide remarks when things didn't go his way. People either laughed nervously or avoided him altogether. Deep down, Mark resented authority figures. Whether it was his boss at work or traffic cops pulling someone over, he couldn't stand anyone who acted superior. This resentment simmered quietly inside him, waiting for the right moment to boil over. On his second day in London, Mark woke up early, eager to explore. By mid-morning, he found himself strolling through St. James's Park, admiring the lush greenery and the calm waters of the lake. As he approached Buckingham Palace, the crowd thickened. Families with children, couples holding hands, and groups of friends buzzed with excitement. Mark joined them, craning his neck to get a better view of the palace gates. The golden railing gleamed under the sunlight, and the Union Jack fluttered proudly atop the roof. It was everything he imagined, and more. Then came the guards. Dressed in their bright red tunics and towering bearskin hats, they marched in perfect synchronization during the changing of the guard ceremony. The precision was mesmerizing, but Mark felt irritated instead of impressed. To him, their stoic expressions seemed arrogant, as if they were too good to acknowledge the cheering crowd. "What's the big deal?" he muttered to himself, rolling his eyes. When he tried to crack jokes about their outfits, no one laughed. Instead, people gave him sideways glances, clearly unimpressed by his attempts at humor. Feeling ignored and slighted, Mark's mood soured. He started pacing back and forth, muttering complaints under his breath. Someone bumped into him accidentally, and he snapped, shouting rudely until the person apologized profusely. But even that didn't satisfy him. Something inside Mark wanted to lash out, to show everyone that he mattered, that he wouldn't be dismissed so easily. Little did he know this growing frustration was about to lead him down a path he could never undo, a single reckless act that would change his life forever. As the ceremony continued, Mark stood among the sea of tourists, his irritation growing with each passing minute. The guards moved with mechanical precision, their faces expressionless as if they were carved from stone. To Mark, this felt like mockery, a display of superiority meant to silence anyone who dared question their authority. His fists clenched at his sides, and he muttered under his breath, "What's so special about them anyway? They're just standing there doing nothing." The crowd around him was buzzing with excitement. Children pointed at the guards in awe, parents snapped photos, and couples whispered to each other, marveling at the spectacle. But Mark couldn't share in their enthusiasm. Instead, he felt increasingly alienated, as though everyone else had been let in on some secret joke that excluded him. When he tried to make another sarcastic comment, this time about how ridiculous the bearskin hats looked, not a single person laughed. In fact, an older woman nearby turned to glare at him, shaking her head disapprovingly. That small moment of rejection stung more than Mark cared to admit. He wasn't used to being ignored. Back home, his loud personality usually commanded attention, whether people liked it or not. Here, surrounded by strangers who didn't understand his humor, he felt powerless. His frustration bubbled over into anger, and he began pacing along the edge of the crowd, muttering louder now. "You guys think this is impressive?" he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "They're just statues wearing uniforms." His words drew a few curious glances, but no one responded. Mark noticed a group of teenagers giggling nearby, clearly entertained by something on one of their phones. He scowled, convinced they were laughing at him. It didn't matter that he had no proof. It fueled his resentment even more. The weight, a feeling invisible, pressed down on him, twisting his thoughts until he convinced himself that the guard's stoic demeanor was a personal insult aimed directly at him. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he spotted a souvenir shop tucked away, near the palace gates. On impulse, he wandered inside, still fuming. The shelves were lined with trinkets and mementos, keychains shaped like phone booths, tiny replicas of Big Ben, and colorful cans of paint labeled Union Jack Red. Something about the paint caught his attention. An idea flickered in his mind, an impulsive, reckless plan that made his pulse quicken. What if he could shake things up? What if he could prove a point, show everyone that these guards weren't untouchable? Mark grabbed one of the cans and paid for it without hesitation. As he walked back toward the ceremony, his heart raced. Part of him knew what he was considering was wrong, but another part, the part fueled by frustration and pride, shouted louder. He told himself it would be funny, just a harmless prank to break the monotony of the stiff, formal event. No one would get hurt, right? And besides, maybe it would finally get people to notice him. When he returned to the crowd, he scanned the area carefully. Security guards patrolled the perimeter, keeping a watchful eye on the tourists. Cameras mounted on poles captured every angle of the ceremony. For a brief moment, doubt crept in. Was this really worth it? But then he remembered the disapproving looks, the laughter directed elsewhere, and the silent indifference of the guards. His jaw tightened, and he pushed aside any lingering hesitation. Standing just a few feet away from one of the motionless guards, Mark hesitated again, but only for a second. He glanced around, noting how distracted some of the spectators were. A family nearby was busy taking selfies, while others were engrossed in conversation. This was his chance. With a deep breath, he stepped closer, clutching the can of paint tightly in his hand. His mind raced with conflicting emotions, fear, excitement, defiance. Whatever happened next, he told himself, would make people pay attention. Whether they liked it or not, Mark Thompson was about to leave his mark, literally. Mark's grip tightened around the small can of paint as he inched closer to the guard. His heart pounded so loudly in his chest that he was sure everyone around him could hear it. The guard stood perfectly still, his face a mask of calm authority, oblivious to the chaos brewing just inches away. Mark's mind raced with conflicting thoughts. What am I doing? This is crazy. But beneath the doubt was a fiery determination. He wanted to make a statement, to disrupt the rigid formality of the scene and force people to acknowledge him. The moment felt surreal, like time had slowed down. Mark glanced around one last time, ensuring no one was paying attention to him, specifically. To his relief, most of the crowd was focused on the ceremony, snapping pictures or chatting excitedly. A group of children nearby waved tiny Union Jack flags, their laughter ringing out into the crisp London air. For a split second, Mark hesitated. These were innocent people enjoying a cultural tradition, a tradition he didn't fully understand and had never respected enough to learn about. But instead of stopping, he convinced himself that this act would somehow level the playing field, bringing these untouchable guards down to his level. With a deep breath, Mark unscrewed the cap of the paint can, his hands trembling slightly. He held it up high, aiming for the pristine red tunic of the guard standing before him. Before he could second-guess himself, he tilted the can and poured its contents onto the unsuspecting guard. Bright red paint splattered across the uniform, dripping down onto the polished boots below. The crowd gasped collectively, their cheerful murmurs turning into shocked cries. "What are you doing?" someone shouted from behind him. "Stop him!" another voice yelled, filled with outrage. For a brief moment, Mark froze, his eyes wide as he took in the scene unfolding around him. The guard, true to his training, remained completely motionless, not even flinching as the sticky liquid soaked through his jacket. It was as if the guard had become a statue, frozen in place despite the chaos erupting around him. Mark stared at the man, half expecting some reaction, a glare, a step forward, anything. But there was nothing. That lack of response only fueled his growing unease. Security officers stationed nearby sprang into action almost instantly. Two burly men in dark uniforms pushed their way through the stunned crowd, heading straight for Mark. Panic surged through him as he realized the gravity of what he'd just done. Wait, he stammered, holding up his hands defensively. It was just a joke, I didn't mean any harm. But no one was laughing. Instead, angry faces surrounded him, some shouting accusations, others shaking their heads in disbelief. Someone shoved their phone in his face, capturing the aftermath of his reckless act. Tourists who had been enjoying the ceremony moments earlier now pointed fingers at him, labeling him as the villain in this story. Mark tried to explain himself, raising his voice over the commotion. I wasn't trying to hurt anyone. You get it? They're just standing there pretending to be better than us. His words fell flat. No one seemed interested in hearing his excuses. One of the security officers grabbed him firmly by the arm, pulling him away from the scene. You're coming with us, the officer growled, his tone leaving no room for argument. Mark stumbled along, dropping the empty paint can as he was dragged toward a nearby patrol car. Cameras flashed all around him, capturing every detail of his humiliation. Strangers recorded videos, their phones trained on him like spotlights, exposing his shame. As he was shoved into the back seat of the police car, Mark caught sight of the guard once more. The man hadn't moved an inch, standing tall and dignified, despite the mess covering his uniform. There was something haunting about that image, a stark contrast between Mark's chaotic impulsiveness and the guard's unwavering composure. For the first time since arriving in London, Mark felt truly small. The car door slammed shut, sealing him inside. Sirens wailed as the vehicle pulled away from the palace gates, leaving behind a crowd still buzzing with shock and anger. Mark slumped against the seat, his mind racing. What had he done? How could he have let things spiral so far out of control? As the reality of his actions began to sink in, a wave of dread washed over him. He had wanted attention, but not like this. Not at the cost of ruining everything he'd worked so hard to achieve. The police car sped through the streets of London, its sirens blaring as Mark sat slumped in the back seat, his mind a whirlwind of regret and panic. He stared out the window, watching the iconic cityscape blur past. Big Ben, the Thames, the historic buildings he had been so excited to see just hours earlier. Now those landmarks felt distant, almost mocking, as if they were reminders of how quickly his dream vacation had turned into a nightmare. His hands trembled in his lap, and his heart raced with every turn the car took. Where were they taking him? What would happen next? When the car finally pulled into a police station, Mark was escorted inside like a criminal caught red-handed. The cold, sterile atmosphere of the building hit him immediately. Harsh fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, illuminating rows of desks where officers typed on computers or spoke into radios. The air smelled faintly of coffee and paperwork, but beneath that was an undeniable tension, a sense that this place dealt with troublemakers every day. Mark felt out of place, a small-town man thrust into a world he didn't understand. He was led to a small interrogation room, where he sat alone for what felt like hours. The walls were bare except for a clock that ticked loudly, each second, stretching longer than the last. Mark's mind raced. Would he be arrested? Fined? Deported? He thought about calling his family back home, but quickly dismissed the idea. How could he explain this to them? They'd never believe it. Or worse, they'd be ashamed. He buried his face in his hands, trying to block out the reality of the situation. Eventually, two officers entered the room, their expressions stern. One carried a notepad, while the other placed a digital recorder on the table between them. "We need you to explain yourself," one of them said bluntly. Mark swallowed hard, his throat dry. He stammered through his account of the incident, repeating the same weak defense he'd given at Buckingham Palace. "It was just a joke. I didn't mean any harm. But even as the words left his mouth, he knew how hollow they sounded. Officers exchanged skeptical glances before informing him of the charges: vandalism, public disorder, and behavior likely to cause harassment or distress. Each charge hit Mark like a punch to the gut. Vandalism? That sounded serious, criminal even. Public disorder? He hadn't meant to disrupt anything, he just wanted attention. And harassment? The word made him cringe. Was that really how people saw him now? As some kind of menace? By the time the interrogation ended, news of Mark's actions had already spread like wildfire. Social media platforms lit up with videos and photos of the paint-splattered guard, accompanied by outraged captions, labeling Mark a disrespectful tourist. Someone identified him online, sharing old posts from his personal accounts that painted him in an even worse light. Comments flooded in, calling him names and demanding justice. Within hours, his face became infamous worldwide, plastered across headlines alongside phrases like reckless American and disgraceful act. Back home, the backlash grew fiercer. Local news stations picked up the story, airing clips of the incident during primetime broadcasts. Neighbors who once greeted him with polite smiles now avoided eye contact, whispering behind closed doors. His employer called him late that night, their tone cold and formal. "We've decided to terminate your contract," they said. "This reflects poorly on our company." Mark listened in stunned silence, the weight of his actions sinking deeper with each passing moment. As days turned into weeks, Mark realized the full extent of the damage he had caused. Not only had he disrespected a centuries-old tradition, but he had also alienated himself from nearly everyone he knew. Friends stopped answering his calls. Family members expressed disappointment, unsure how to reconcile the Mark they thought they knew with the man splashed across global headlines. Even strangers joined in, vandalizing his house with graffiti and sending hateful messages online. The court date loomed ahead, adding to his anxiety. Legal fees piled up, draining what little savings he had left. Every attempt he made to defend himself, claiming ignorance, blaming frustration, insisting it was all a harmless prank, only fueled more anger. People weren't buying it. To the world, Mark wasn't just a foolish tourist. He was a symbol of arrogance and disrespect. And no matter how much he protested, there was no escaping the consequences of his reckless decision. The courtroom was quiet, save for the faint rustle of papers and the occasional cough. Mark sat at the defendant's table, his hands clasped tightly together, his knuckles white from the pressure. He wore a suit he had borrowed from a friend. It was slightly too big for him, making him look even smaller and more out of place than he already felt. The room smelled of polished wood and old books, an atmosphere that seemed far removed from the chaos Mark had caused just weeks earlier. But there was no escaping it now. This was where his recklessness would be judged. When the judge entered, everyone stood up respectfully. Mark followed suit, though his legs felt like jelly beneath him. As he took his seat again, he glanced around the room. Reporters scribbled notes in the back, their eyes occasionally darting toward him with undisguised disdain. A few members of the public had shown up, curious to witness the fallout of the infamous paint incident. Among them was a representative from Buckingham Palace, sitting stiffly with a folder of documents detailing the disruption Mark had caused. Even the lawyers on both sides looked tense, exchanging brief words before proceedings began. The prosecutor wasted no time laying out the case against Mark. This wasn't just vandalism, they declared, their voice firm and commanding. It was an attack on tradition, on respect, on everything those guards stand for. It disrespected not only the individuals involved, but also the institution they represent, an institution cherished by millions around the world. The prosecutor went on to describe the ripple effects of Mark's actions, the cost of cleaning and repairing the guard's uniform, the emotional toll on the guard himself, and the damage done to diplomatic relations between nations. Each point landed like a hammer blow, leaving Mark feeling increasingly cornered. When it was his turn to speak, Mark struggled to find the right words. His lawyer nudged him gently, urging him to address the court. I didn't mean to hurt anyone, he started, his voice trembling. I thought it was funny. At the time, I mean. I didn't realize how serious it was. He paused, searching for understanding in the faces around him, but found none. Instead, he saw folded arms, raised eyebrows, and pursed lips, signs of skepticism and judgment. The judge listened patiently but offered little sympathy. When it came time for sentencing, the verdict was harsh, yet unsurprising. Mark was fined thousands of dollars, a sum that wiped out what remained of his savings. Worse still, he was banned from ever returning to the United Kingdom. Your actions were reckless, disrespectful, and entirely unacceptable, the judge said sternly, their tone leaving no room for argument. You have tarnished not only your own reputation but also the goodwill extended to visitors of this nation. As Mark left the courthouse, cameras flashed in his face, capturing every step of his walk of shame. Reporters shouted questions at him, but he kept his head down, avoiding eye contact. Inside, he felt hollow, as if the weight of the world had crushed whatever confidence he once possessed. Back home, things weren't much better. Friends who hadn't already distanced themselves now avoided him completely. Family gatherings became awkward affairs, with relatives tiptoeing around the subject or outright confronting him about his behavior. Desperate to salvage something from the wreckage of his life, Mark tried to fight back against the narrative surrounding him. In interviews, he doubled down on his excuses, insisting he hadn't intended to offend anyone. People are blowing this way out of proportion, he argued, during one particularly heated exchange with a journalist. I'm not racist. I'm not evil. I made a mistake, sure, but why does everyone hate me so much? But the harder he pushed, the worse the backlash became. Social media users pounced on his comments, accusing him of refusing to take responsibility. Memes mocking him spread like wildfire, further cementing his status as a cautionary tale. Even attempts to apologize fell flat, dismissed as insincere or performative. Mark realized, perhaps too late, that his words carried little weight now. The damage was done, and no amount of explaining could undo it. Isolated and defeated, Mark retreated into himself. He stopped answering calls, avoided social events, and spent most of his days holed up in his apartment, scrolling through news articles and comment sections despite knowing it would only make him feel worse. Every mention of his name online brought fresh waves of humiliation. For the first time in his life, Mark understood what it meant to truly regret something, not just the act itself, but its far-reaching consequences. And as he lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling, he couldn't help but wonder if he'd ever be able to rebuild his shattered life. Mark's days became a blur of monotony and regret. After the trial, he returned to his small hometown, hoping to escape the relentless scrutiny that had followed him everywhere. But even here, where familiar streets and faces should have brought comfort, he found no peace. The local grocery store, once a mundane errand, now felt like a gauntlet. Neighbors whispered behind their hands as he passed by, their eyes following him with a mix of pity and disdain. Cashiers avoided making small talk, ringing up his purchases in silence before quickly averting their gaze. His apartment became a refuge of sorts, a place where he could shut out the world and hide from the judgment that seemed to follow him like a shadow. Yet, even within those four walls, there was no escaping the weight of what he'd done. Every news alert on his phone, every viral tweet, every late-night talk show joke about that guy who poured paint on a royal guard served as a reminder of how deeply he had embarrassed himself and others. He tried deleting social media apps, but it didn't help. The damage wasn't confined to the internet. It lived in real life too, written across people's faces whenever they saw him. One evening, while aimlessly flipping through TV channels, Mark stumbled upon a documentary about Buckingham Palace. It showcased centuries of tradition, highlighting the dedication and discipline required to serve as a royal guard. Watching the segment, he felt a pang of guilt sharper than anything he'd experienced before. These weren't just faceless figures, standing around for tourists to gawk at. They were individuals who took pride in their roles, representing something larger than themselves. And he had treated them with utter disrespect. That realization gnawed at him, refusing to let go. For weeks, Mark wrestled with conflicting emotions, shame over what he'd done, frustration at being vilified, and anger at himself for letting things spiral so far out of control. He knew he couldn't undo the past, but maybe, just maybe, he could do something to make amends. It was a fragile thought, barely more than a flicker of hope, but it gave him a sliver of purpose. Determined to try, Mark enrolled in a local sensitivity training program. At first he hesitated. It felt humiliating to sit in a room with strangers discussing topics like cultural awareness and empathy. But as the sessions progressed, he began to see patterns in his behavior that he hadn't noticed before. His tendency to lash out when ignored, his dismissive attitude toward traditions he didn't understand, his belief that rules somehow didn't apply to him, all of it pointed to deeper issues he needed to confront. To supplement the classes, Mark started volunteering at community events focused on diversity and inclusion. At first, his presence raised eyebrows. Some organizers questioned whether he truly meant to change or if this was another attempt to deflect blame. But Mark persisted, showing up week after week, quietly helping set up tables, handing out flyers, or simply listening when people shared their stories. Slowly, very slowly, some began to soften toward him. A few even acknowledged his efforts, though cautiously. Despite these small victories, doubts lingered both inside and outside Mark. Online, critics dismissed his actions as performative, accusing him of trying to polish his image without genuine remorse. Even close acquaintances remained skeptical, unsure if his transformation was real or just another act. Mark understood why people felt that way. He'd burned too many bridges, but the lack of trust stung nonetheless. One day during a volunteer event, a young woman approached him. She introduced herself as Aisha, a local activist working to promote multicultural understanding. Her tone was measured but firm. "I've seen you here a lot lately," she said, studying him carefully. "Are you doing this because you actually care, or are you just trying to fix your reputation?" The question caught Mark off guard. For a moment he considered brushing it off with a rehearsed answer, but something stopped him. Instead, he met her gaze and replied honestly, "Both, I guess. I messed up big time, and I can't take it back. But I want to learn. I need to learn, so I don't hurt anyone else again." Aisha nodded slowly, her expression unreadable. Then she handed him a flyer for an upcoming panel discussion on cultural respect. "If you're serious, come to this," she said simply. "It's not going to be easy, but nothing worth doing ever is." As she walked away, Mark stared at the flyer in his hand, feeling a mix of fear and resolve. Maybe redemption wouldn't come easily, or at all, but he owed it to himself, and to everyone he'd wronged, to keep trying. Mark's journey toward redemption was anything but smooth. Attending the panel discussion Aisha had invited him to marked the beginning of a long, uphill battle, one that tested his patience, humility, and resolve at every turn. The event was held in a modest community center, its walls adorned with colorful posters promoting unity and understanding. When Mark walked in, he immediately felt out of place. Most attendees were locals who had dedicated their lives to fostering inclusivity and celebrating diversity. They exchanged warm greetings and shared stories about their work, while Mark hovered awkwardly near the refreshment table, unsure if anyone would welcome him. When the discussion began, speakers took turns sharing powerful anecdotes about overcoming prejudice and bridging cultural divides. One woman recounted her experience as an immigrant facing hostility in a new country. Another spoke passionately about the importance of preserving traditions while embracing change. Each story resonated deeply with the audience, drawing murmurs of agreement and applause. Mark listened intently, his chest tightening with a mix of emotions, guilt over his own actions, admiration for those who worked so hard to build bridges, and determination to follow their example. During the Q&A session, Mark hesitated before raising his hand. His palms were sweaty, and his heart raced as all eyes turned to him. I want to say thank you," he began, his voice trembling slightly. "Hearing your stories makes me realize how much I've taken for granted and how much harm I've caused." He paused, swallowing hard. I'm not asking for forgiveness because I know I don't deserve it yet. But I promise to keep learning and doing better." The room fell silent. Some people nodded thoughtfully, while others exchanged skeptical glances. Aisha, sitting nearby, gave him a small, encouraging smile. Though the response wasn't overwhelmingly positive, Mark felt a flicker of hope. For the first time, he had admitted his mistakes publicly, not to defend himself, but to acknowledge the pain he'd caused. Over the following months, Mark threw himself into volunteer work, attending workshops, participating in cultural festivals, and mentoring teenagers from underprivileged backgrounds. At first, his efforts drew mixed reactions. Some praised his willingness to step outside his comfort zone, while others dismissed him as a fraud trying to save face. Even within his own family, opinions were divided. His younger sister, Sarah, was cautiously supportive, urging him to stay, committed despite setbacks. "It's not about proving them wrong," she told him one evening. "It's about proving to yourself that you can be better." But progress came slowly, and setbacks were inevitable. During a multicultural fair, a vendor recognized Mark and loudly accused him of exploiting minority communities for personal gain. Others joined in, shouting accusations until Mark had no choice but to leave, humiliated and shaken. That night, he sat alone in his apartment, replaying the incident in his mind. Doubts crept in, whispering that maybe he didn't deserve a second chance after all. Still, something inside him refused to give up. He remembered Aisha's words. Nothing worth doing ever is easy. So he kept going, focusing on small victories rather than grand gestures. Over time, his persistence began to pay off. A local teacher invited him to speak to her students about accountability and growth. Though nervous, Mark accepted, pouring his heart into the presentation. To his surprise, the students responded positively, asking thoughtful questions and thanking him afterward. These moments of connection became lifelines, reminding Mark why he had started this journey in the first place. Yet, even as he built new relationships and earned tentative trust, he knew full well that redemption wasn't a destination. It was a continuous process. The scars of his past actions would always remain, visible reminders of the man he used to be. But perhaps, he thought, that was okay. After all, it was only by confronting those scars that he could truly begin to heal, not just for himself, but for everyone he had hurt along the way. Years passed, and Mark's life settled into a quiet rhythm. The headlines that once screamed his name faded into obscurity, replaced by newer scandals and fleeting internet outrage. He no longer cringed at the sound of his phone buzzing or dreaded opening his front door. Instead, he spent his days working odd jobs, landscaping, warehouse shifts, anything to keep busy, and volunteering in his community. His efforts weren't flashy or widely recognized, but they mattered to him. Each small act of kindness felt like a step forward, a way to chip away at the mountain of regret he carried. Mark had moved out of his old apartment, trading it for a modest house on the edge of town. It was far enough from prying eyes that he could live without constant reminders of his past mistakes, yet close enough to stay connected to the people who were slowly beginning to see him differently. On weekends, he often visited schools or youth centers, sharing his story with teenagers. "I messed up big time," he'd tell them, his voice steady but sincere. "And I can't take it back. But what I can do is learn from it and try to make better choices moving forward." The students didn't always respond enthusiastically. Some rolled their eyes, dismissing him as just another adult preaching lessons they'd heard before. Others, though, listened intently, asking questions about how he managed to rebuild his life after such public failure. To those kids, Mark offered practical advice. Apologize when you're wrong, listen more than you speak, and never stop trying to understand perspectives different from your own. He didn't pretend to have all the answers. He knew he didn't, but his honesty resonated with some of them in ways he hadn't expected. Back home, Mark spent evenings reflecting on his journey. He kept a journal now, filling its pages with thoughts about gratitude, accountability, and growth. Writing helped him process the emotions that still surfaced unexpectedly: guilt over the harm he'd caused, frustration at the lingering skepticism, and pride in the progress he'd made. One entry stood out among the rest. Redemption isn't about being forgiven by others. It's about forgiving yourself while still owning your mistakes. That's where real change starts. Though many in his hometown still viewed him with suspicion, there were glimmers of acceptance. A few neighbors greeted him warmly when they crossed paths, and a local cafe owner even invited him to join a book club focused on cultural understanding. These small gestures meant the world to Mark, proof that trust could be rebuilt, however slowly. Even Aisha, who had initially doubted his intentions, admitted during one candid conversation that she saw genuine effort in his actions. "You're not perfect," she said bluntly, "but neither is anyone else. What matters is that you're trying." Still, Mark knew he couldn't erase the damage he'd done. The viral videos, the angry headlines, the hurtful memes, they were etched into the digital record forever. Occasionally, someone would recognize him online or bring up the incident in passing, reopening old wounds. But instead of lashing out or retreating into bitterness, Mark chose to acknowledge the pain he'd caused. "You're right," he'd say simply. "I was wrong, and I'm sorry." As the years went by, Mark found solace in teaching younger generations about empathy and respect. He partnered with local organizations to create programs aimed at fostering cross-cultural dialogue, using his story as both a cautionary tale and a testament to the possibility of change. While some dismissed his involvement as performative, others praised his commitment to turning his mistake into something constructive. In private moments, Mark allowed himself to dream again, not of grand adventures or worldwide recognition, but of quieter victories. He envisioned a future where fewer people repeated his mistakes, where misunderstandings gave way to mutual respect, and where fear of judgment didn't overshadow the courage to grow. Redemption might have come too late for most to notice, but for Mark it was enough. After everything he'd been through, he finally understood that true transformation wasn't about erasing the past. It was about building a better tomorrow, one small step at a time.